Should Catholic preachers use communications technology in their homilies? Should they use it in their preaching? Should they be using PowerPoint? Should they be using Prezi? Should they be using videos? Catholic preachers ask that questions because certainly they have seen this technology used in Protestant preaching. Protestant preachers, whether televised or in their churches, have used this technology, even technology which polls the congregation in response to some question that has been posed in the sermon. But for Catholic preachers, the question has to be, we have a mission carved out for us by the church. We are carrying out a mission of preaching which has been given to us. It's a commission. And that mission of preaching is a renewed vision of the homily which has come out of the Second Vatican Council. And is technology in media or media in our preaching consistent with that view? Well, certainly, if we look at the history of the church, there have always been examples of evangelists who have been at the forefront of using recent media to spread the word, going all the way back to people like St. Francis de Sales, who in the 16th century used the printing press to print his tracts, reflections, and slide them under the door of the Protestant homes in Geneva. That's why he becomes the patron of journalists, for example. But in the 20th century, when we have so many developments, beginning with radio, the people in the church, preachers and evangelists, were also right there, right at the forefront, using them as soon as they became available. Father Leslie Rumble in Sydney, Australia. Father Charles Mortimer Carty from St. Paul, Minnesota, in the 1920s and 30s used radio broadcasts to reach a large variety of people and collected these broadcasts and printed them in books called Radio Replies. Father Charles Coughlin had a regular Sunday program from the 20s right up into the early 40s, in which he spoke not only about the Catholic faith, but connected the Catholic faith to economics and to politics. More well known, perhaps for most of us, is Archbishop Fulton Sheen, who started like Father Rumble and Father Carty and Father Coughlin using radio, but then as soon as television became available, moved into television. So he had Life is Worth Living, a series from 1951 to 1957, or the Fulton Sheen program, 1961-68, and used it so effectively, reached so many people, that he even won an Emmy Award in 1952, beating out people like Lucille Ball and Arthur Godfrey. Can you imagine? At the time, he is famous for making the thank you speech where he thanked his writers. He said, "I'd like to thank my 4 writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John," a line that only would possible for someone like Archbishop Fulton Sheen. A little later, we have Miss Media herself, Mother Angelica, a Poor Clare nun, who in the Bible Belt in the South starts up EWTN, the Eternal Word Television Network, which is now 24 hours, radio, television, and internet. And in 1984, she began her own program, Mother Angelica Presents, which later is retitled Mother Angelica Live, during which she preached extensively, often with an open Bible on her lap, and preached extensively directly to the TV audience. Wasn't preaching a homily, of course. But it was preaching a sermon. It was preaching outside of liturgy, and it was preaching the Word of God. Now, Father Benedict Groeschel, who was a Capuchin friar, a psychologist, he founded the Franciscan Friars of the Renewal in New York in 1987. He appeared on EWTN regularly, had his own programs there, and he did preach homilies. He did preach retreats. He did preach reflections, which had a wide viewership and was distributed through DVDs and audio tapes and so on. In more modern times, very recently, the most well-known Catholic media person is Bishop Robert Barron, who in 1999 began a weekly Word on Fire radio program, which took off, and in 2002 became Word on Fire Catholic Ministries. And he has since producing television programs, recording his and broadcasting his homilies, and he has produced a number of television programs on Catholicism, on the lives of the saints, which have made their way into public television and have thus reached a great number of people. So all of these people are examples of how the church is consistently on the forefront of using of putting preaching in media, and it's something the church has encouraged. Pope John Paul II, Pope Benedict, Pope Francis all endorse these on World Communication Days. In fact, that the church has World Communication Days is a indication of the emphasis that the church does put on using modern media. However, these are all examples of preaching in media. So a homily is recorded, a sermon is recorded, a reflection is recorded, and then broadcast. That's a very different thing, or a very different question, from whether or not the preacher should use media in preaching, particularly when we meet the homily and during a liturgy. And whereas the church is very strongly endorsing preaching in media, the church has been taking a stand back, let's look and see, let's observe attitude toward whether or not preachers really should be using media in their preaching. That means we have to look at both cases. What is the case for using it? What is the case against it? And in the end, how do either one of those cases actually fit with what we know the church is looking for from preaching? Pope Benedict came up with the very interesting term that we have now entered the digital continent. So we have the continents of the world, but now there's this new digital continent that spans the world. And so the argument is that we need to engage with that. Now, the church has not, aside from encouraging preaching in media, has said very little about the technology that can be used in the church buildings and during liturgy itself. We have some old documents. In 1958, this is well before the Second Vatican Council, there was a document called De Musica Sacra e Sacra Liturgia, of sacred music and sacred liturgies, 1958. And in it, it said, in section 71, that the use of automatic instruments and machines, such as the automatic organ, or the phonograph, or the radio, or tape or wire recorders, and other similar machines, is absolutely forbidden in liturgical functions and private devotions, whether in or outside of the church. It was not just we really don't like it or we discourage it, it is absolutely forbidden. Well, the Second Vatican Council comes along and it doesn't endorse this, and neither does it remove this, and it doesn't really say very much, but it does give us a renewed vision of preaching. And we'll take a look at that in a moment to see how that fits. But what the council did do was leave many of these decisions about how much technology could be used up to local bishops' conferences. And there have been different bishop conferences that have made different decisions. Some have forbidden preachers, pastors, celebrants to bring up a laptop or an iPod to the ambo. Some have limited the use of the screen to only the lyrics of hymns. Others have made statements that they are strongly discourage the use of any kind of media or equipment, and calling it even a danger, a danger that the media becomes a main focus of the mass rather than the liturgical action, and so on. So the question is then, if a preacher wants to use any kind of technology like this, the first thing to do is to find out what his own particular archdiocesan policies might be, because they may differ from place to place. The next thing is to look at the cases for and against. Now, proponents of this technology recognize, or they say, that the world has changed and that preaching needs to connect, that preaching must preach in intentional ways, that it must use all of the tools and techniques available to engage people in this digital continent. And in particular, they speak about declining church attendance, and they speak about the need to attract younger people. They say it's a way of keeping the church current. And one argument that is used is that the church has always made use of the image, whether it's in the form of statues or icons or stained glass windows, great works of art on the ceiling, that they have always made use of images, and that we are indeed a very incarnational church. So the sacraments themselves have these visual qualities. And so using this digital technology is just simply another way of employing images, using everything for the greater glory of God. And the people who encourage the use of media in preaching, particularly the homily, will also quote scripture. They'll say, well, Jesus himself said in Matthew 13, "Every scribe who has been trained for the kingdom of heaven is like the master of a household who brings out of his treasure what is new and what is old." And they argue what is old is the gospel, and what is new is the technology. And so encourage us to embrace all of these things. But then there are Catholic preachers who weigh in against this, who sound some warning bells. Some are worried that this experimentation is going to rely on just create a situation where homilies become dependent on visual aids, and that visual aids in themselves become gimmicks and thus take the place of real substance. And in particular, that it devalues the preaching as a one-on-one encounter of what fulfilled in your hearing, the great American document on the homily says, is a person of faith speaking to a person of faith. Or Cardinal Newman, when he says preaching is heart speaking to heart. Other preachers or other Catholic writers and thinkers have warned that or suggested that the better the homilist, the less likely the homilist would want to be to rely on media, because the homilist wants have the people concentrate on what he is saying and on the person of the preacher in the ambo. The arguments that preachers in this camp make is that preaching is meant to be conversational, and that is certainly one of the qualities of patristic preaching, which was adopted in the Second Vatican Council, and that the introduction of media, the introduction of video clips, the introduction of screens, the diversion of attention to a PowerPoint slide is mitigating against the interpersonal quality, and in fact diverting attention away from the speaker, from the person of faith. So there have been some surveys around the effectiveness of some of these things. Dr. Lori Carroll, in her rather famous book, The Great American Sermon Survey, in which she surveyed both Protestant preachers and Catholic preachers, found that whereas many preachers, particularly the Protestant preachers, were excited by the potential of PowerPoint and were committed to using it, the listeners showed, in fact, the majority of listeners found that PowerPoint was for them more of a distraction, diminished eye contact, made it difficult for them to pick up the facial expressions, and actually created a sense of distance between the preacher and the congregation. So, what do we do with all of this? Well, if the church has not made a clear pronouncement on thou shall not use or thou may use PowerPoint or videos or and so on, the church has given us a clear picture of what it wants from preaching in the homiletic directory. And by looking at the homiletic directory, one can see the principles which you can apply, that should you end up choosing to try some of these technologies, and if it's permitted in your diocese, principles that you would not want to violate. So the first thing is, a preacher should always ask himself about any decision he makes in a homily, why am I doing this? Is this absolutely essential? Whether he simply is telling a joke or whether he wants to use a PowerPoint. Why am I telling this joke? Why am I using this PowerPoint? Is this germ? Is this essential? Is this necessary to what I want to do? Or is it a distraction? Am I putting it in for the furthering of the pearl, for the furthering of the message? Or am I putting it in for some other reason, to get them to like me, to seem contemporary, to elicit a laugh? If there's any of these reasons, then it is best, whatever it is you're considering, to not use that, because you're putting yourself, your own agenda, your own interests, your own desires ahead of the actual message that is coming out of the readings of that particular Mass. But then, if you've asked that question and you decide that it is essential, that it is useful, that it is really valuable, then you can start to look at the specific technology that you use and how you are using it. So, for example, the homiletic directory tells us what a homily is not. It says a homily is not meant to be a lecture, catechetical instruction, or an exegesis. So that means that if we end up using a PowerPoint, to not use a PowerPoint as a teaching tool, as it's used in a classroom. And that would usually be with bulleted points and a lot of information, so that now people are reading information rather than looking at and listening to the preacher. They don't have a notebook. They're not taking information down. That perhaps the best use of a PowerPoint in that case would be maybe a single image. If you have an image about something that you are speaking at a biblical event, maybe it's a painting of that event, maybe a possibility, because they really need to see that at that point. Or if you're speaking about the Holy Land and they need to see the place where the event actually happened. So the first thing is to avoid too much writing on the screen if you're doing PowerPoint. The second is that the homiletic directory tells us that the homily is not an entertainment. So you are not there primarily to make people laugh or to have them, or you're not there for enjoyment. The people can enjoy a well-delivered homily, but you're not there to really just be giving them an entertainment or a good time. So that would mean warning the preacher not to use audio, visual, or digital media for its own sake, because it's attractive, as a kind of distraction, because it will be a crowd pleaser. The homily is not meant to be a diversion, and anything in the homily should not be a diversion from the main message that is coming out of that Mass. The homily is also, according to the homiletic directory, always to be given by the priest or the deacon, which therefore warns the priest or the preacher not to let audiovisual technology take over the homily, to overwhelm that graced moment of heart-to-heart speaking, or to even dictate how the preacher preaches. So, for example, using a video, which takes up a large portion of the preaching time, so it's now everything in the video, and it's not the preacher himself, or it's the people in the video, and not the people in him, and not the preacher himself who's doing his own particular speaking. The homily also, says the homiletic directory, is to be tailored to a particular congregation at a particular time and a particular place. That means, says the homiletic directory, that the preacher is to avoid generic homilies, and particularly to avoid generic homilies lifted from the internet. But also, at the same time, if we're talking about using technology, it's a warning not to let the homily be dominated with generic media that take away time from concretizing the homily for particular listeners. So we have something that is no longer, which is specific and heart to heart, and that is speaking to the particular people here. The homily is to be fully integrated with the liturgy. That's one of the main points of the homiletic directory, and one of the main points that Pope Benedict, Pope Francis have made in the last several years, because the homily is not to be the Mass on hold. And it is to be, integration means that it connects with the other parts of the homily, but it also connects not just in terms of references to the other parts, but in terms of style, in terms of tone. So it's a model of preaching that has called for a clear link of the homily with everything else going on in that particular liturgy. So then a preacher who's using digital media or videos or whatever needs to be very careful that the use of that media does suddenly not create a radical break from the way the rest of the liturgy looks, that the rest of the liturgy looks a certain way, a very traditional way, and then all of a sudden it's now looking quite lively or up-tempo or something which is out of keeping with the rest of that whole liturgy. The recent popes have also spoke about the need for the homily to be brief. Now, that's a big question. What does the word brief mean? St. Francis de Sales thought brevity meant 30 minutes. We've been in North America, we hear about 10 minutes, but it's different in different places of the world. But the idea is that the homily is not meant to overbalance the second part of the Mass, the liturgy of the Eucharist, and that it is a part of the homily, part of the liturgy of the Word, so an extension of the readings. Well, if that's the case, then preachers are very cautioned against using the use of media and video clips if it will extend the homily too long, so that now we have a homily and we have something to say, and then we have a 2 or 3 minute video clip, or we have some PowerPoint presentations, and suddenly it's pushing the lengths of the of that homiletic moment. The homily is primarily an oral event, a listening event. And the directory does refer to the conversational quality of the homily, that it is supposed to be conversational, which really means using the language and the images and the references, which are familiar and common with the listeners. And so the preacher needs to listen and respond to the needs and questions of the congregation, and be able to respond to those needs in their terms, in their language, in a way that's easily understood. So this cautions the preacher, if using digital media, against asking the congregation to read projected material with a lot of text, or providing canned material, or somebody else talking. Finally, probably the most important caution we can draw from the wonderful document, the Homiletic Directory, is that the church wants its preachers to invest time to be good preachers. We are meant to cooperate with God, and He puts in all His grace for us. We are meant to put in all our efforts, all our time, and the church has asked for extended preaching over an extended period of time. And even so much so, says Pope Francis, to take away time from other things that you think may be important and other duties in the church, but that the preaching is the primary apostolate. So using mass media or technology, slides, videos, and so on, prezis, should never be used simply to embellish poor preaching. Shouldn't be used simply to fill up or take to make up for not having spent a lot of good in time invested in getting and developing a good pearl and developing a good message for it. In other words, that the technology simply becomes bells and whistles, becomes crowd pleasers. So a case can be made for the use of digital media. The church does not rule it flat out, but does defer, does ask the preacher to follow the regulations of their local ordinary, and then ask them to use the principles of Catholic preaching as outlined by the Catholic Church, particularly in the Homiletic Directory, as guidelines for not just using technology, but for any choice that they make to keep a homily focused, conversational, scriptural, liturgical, that has a strong, clear pearl and is an oral event of one person speaking to another from heart to heart.